Hello and welcome to ChinaFile Presents. Today's interview is part of our ChinaFile Presents series, which since 2013 has brought ChinaFile editors into conversation with our contributors, as well as with scholars, artists, and writers whose thinking we admire. My name is Jeremy Goldkorn. I am a ChinaFile editorial fellow, founder of the defunct China media website Danwei, former editor-in-chief of the recently defunct China Project, and resident of China from 1995 until 2015. Our guest today is Anne Stevenson-Yang, whom I've known since the 1990s, initially by reputation as a founder of a Beijing entertainment magazine that competed with the one I worked for, and later as a friend. Anne Stevenson-Yang went to China in 1985 and had an extraordinary career as an entrepreneur, China whisperer for US business, publisher, tech startup founder, business commentator, and financial analyst. She's also a writer, and she has just published not one, but two books, which we're going to talk about today. Anne, welcome to ChinaFile Presents.
Thank you, Jeremy.
So it's a big decision and even bigger labor to write a book, but you've written two, both of which are being published at more or less the same time. Wild Ride, a short history of the opening and closing of the Chinese economy, and Hello Kitty and Other Stories, a work of fiction. Wild Ride is a political and economic history with a little bit of personal experience thrown in. Hello Kitty seems to me to be almost, you could think of it as a fictional account of people living through the socioeconomic and political changes that you describe in Wild Ride. Does that sound about right? And why did you decide to work on two books at the same time?
Well, as you know, like so many people, I have an awful lot of stories and books sitting on my computer that found a reason to come to the surface at the same time. I think you're absolutely right that both books respond to the social changes in China and respond to the, I think, misperceptions in the West of China as a thriving, sort of little engine that could sort of economy, striving toward a Jeffersonian democracy, which is really not at all what it is.
Well, let's get into that a little bit. In Wild Ride, you characterize the first 3 decades of reform and opening up as the coming out, the first decade from 79 to 88, the Gilded Age from 89 to 98, and the Go-Go years, the third decade from 1999 until 2008. And then you identify 2009 as the beginning of the next decade that you define as the crisis. And I think those decades, people might disagree about the exact years or the terminology you've used, but I think most observers would agree that that's a fairly natural way to break up those decades. Of course, the global financial crisis began in September 2008 with the collapse of the Lehman Brothers, but many observers see China's response to it as the thing that saved the world from a global recession and as a success story for China. You don't. Can you explain how you see 2009 as the beginning of China's decade of crisis?
I mean, to be honest, I think that it all began with the Olympics, which was the sort of training wheels for China to become a much more repressive, much more suspicious place, and a place where investment ruled all rather than income. That was always the case, but it was really the case after 2008. So basically, from the time of the Olympics, it was not so fun to be in China. And from 2009, when China began to really pour money into infrastructure and property, that's when the explosion of sort of Ozymandian projects began, and when it became almost a sort of moonscape of bizarre projects that were built in order to drive GDP.
It's interesting, that you talk about the Olympics, because I obviously was in Beijing at the time, as you were, and I remember having this sudden realization a few weeks before the Olympics when we weren't allowed to, I wasn't allowed to go on my balcony on Qidayuan, or, suddenly there were these restrictions on outdoor dining. And we had thought that the Olympics, I had naively thought that the Olympics was going to be this global party. And I started to realize that it wasn't going to be a party at all. And that, the intention was not for any fun to be had, but for it to be a big display. Did you feel that at the time? Did you start having these thoughts way back
I
then?
felt that well in advance. So I did a house swap with some friends in San Francisco who wanted to come to Beijing and couldn't find a hotel room. And we decamped before the Olympics and took a little summer vacation so that we could be, because it just seemed, the whole opening ceremony orchestrated by what's his name? Yeah. It just seems so Leni Riefenstahl, so over programmed. And the thing that really got to me that year was I had a couple of friends who were arrested only to meet police quotas. There was nothing that they had done at all. And in order to get themselves freed, it took tens of thousands of dollars and lots of months of machinations through lawyers. And it just seemed, it really soured me on the whole place.
You mentioned that in the book, and these weren't people who were doing anything political, were they? They weren't writers, were they?
Not at all. I mean, I'll give you one example. There was a guy who was meeting with somebody who he thought might be able to put some money into his company, and the police targeted that guy for arrest because he was a VC and he had a lot of money. But this other guy saw that he was being detained by these people who were wearing plainclothes, so he turned around and ran back to help him, and so he had to be taken in as well. So that's the kind of thing that was going on. It was essentially kidnap for hire, I mean, for ransom.
Right. So, I mean, that was that the beginning of the end of your optimism? I mean, you first went to China in 1985. I arrived 10 years later in 1995. And both of us were very much part of the sort of foreign cheerleading squad, in a way, for the opening up of China through the various things we did. Even if we weren't actually saying the cheerleading words, our presence and the types of jobs we were doing and companies we were starting were a part of that. So we participated in the mad economic rush, founded companies and publications that were part of those crazy years. But when did you actually start to lose your optimism or your belief that things could get better? Was it the Olympics?
It started to drip away in the sort of 2006 to 2008 period. At the beginning, in the 1980s and 90s, as you remember very well, it was really fun because things were opening up, things were becoming freer. Chinese people could move around the country and change jobs. They were earning lots more money than they had. And there was all sorts of little outcroppings of art. There was some rock music. There were independent painters. There were poets who would wander through cities and give readings. There was all sorts of, a sort of blossoming. There were dances at the universities. And then that started to change obviously after the Tiananmen protests and the crackdown following Tiananmen. And then it became a much colder, more controlled place. But one understood that it was going to be China for the Chinese. And it became much more a place where Chinese returnees fetched high salaries and had opportunities, and foreigners were in second place. And that's really as it should have been. But it became much more culturally controlled and difficult to navigate throughout the period of, let's say, post 2002. And then at the Olympics, it really turned around.
Yeah. I suppose, everyone has a slightly different marker. I mean, for me, I think the first doubts were the 2006, the Wenming Banwang, the civilized internet campaign, was when I first started to think, oh, things can go backwards.
Yeah.
But it's sort of time span. I know people who were in China in the 60s and 70s who, would have laughed at your naive optimism at one point.
Well, it wasn't an optimism for an endless future. It was just, sort of giddy feeling for what was going on then. And I remember living in the Friendship Hotel in the 1980s and, looking out my window, and there were marches of students going past. They were walking from the university district north of us down to Tiananmen Square. And I went down and joined them a couple of times. And there were people chanting. Of course, there were police that were recording things. But it just seemed like things were really moving and changing, and it would be hard to crack down again. Obviously, 1989 proved that wasn't the case.
Right, right. Yeah. So, I mean, I suppose anyone who was around in the 80s, will 1989 will really be the key turning point. Whereas someone like me who came a little later, I didn't kind of realize how much things had gone backwards that year. Um, so I don't want to read out there's a section right at the end of the book in the epilogue where you talk about being humbled, and I'm tempted to read it out because it's very eloquent and it really grabbed me. But do you have regrets about the way you did things, or do you think if you knew then, way back when, say 1985 or early 90s, what you know now, would you have done things differently should the West, generally speaking, companies have done things differently? Could there have been an alternative path if the outside world had treated China differently, do you think?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, Jeremy. And I'm very pleased that you read all the way to the end of that book. But it's a very interesting question. I think that the fundamental problem with China has actually been a problem with the United States, which is and probably with Europe as well, which is the inability to govern the activities of companies that operate abroad. So there was lots and lots of money made from offshoring to China, and I remember when that was all going on in the 1980s, how thousands of U.S. companies were just like, well, I can get it made at half the price in China, so I really have to because my competitors otherwise will beat me out, and arbitraging the very low labor costs in China. But the U.S. never managed to take that money and plow it into infrastructure in the United States. So that's really on the U.S. political system. What happened in China is, I was a strong advocate because it was my job for China joining the getting most favored nation status and then joining the WTO. I have some questions about that process now because it turns out that China always sort of held a trump card, which is that it would sign all these commitments to allow foreign investors to do X and Y, but then it had approval authority to refuse to allow them to do that. So in certain areas, such as banking and telecom, no progress was really ever made.
MasterCard and Visa were the victims of that particular kind of sleight of hand.
Exactly, for example. And they each of these companies fell for it hook, line, and sinker. Like, oh, dear China, they're opening up and their arms are open to us and they're welcoming us. Well, really not.
Yeah, yeah. So, you've been very negative on certain Chinese companies and on China's economic future for several years now. And in some past conversations I've had with you, dating back quite a few years, you've sometimes made bearish predictions that have not turned out to be exactly true, or at least things haven't panned out yet as badly as you thought they would, as quickly as you thought. Where would you characterize your current kind of thinking on China? And because one obviously doesn't want to necessarily be a Gordon Chang who predicted the imminent collapse of China in 2001 and has been kind of willing it into happening ever since then. And you haven't gone to that extreme, but where would you say your feelings are about what's going to happen? Is it kind of real crisis that's very dangerous for the Communist Party? Is it stumbling along and just kind of, generalized, if I may be permitted a foul word on this platform, shittiness for the average person, or what do you see? Let's take it 5 years, 10 years from now.
Well, let's split that into two separate categories. In the first category is my bad predictions about listed companies. I think China is where I learned the guts of how companies work, and many of them in China have been very corrupt because all of the incentives are in favor of corruption because there's no disincentive to collect money from American investors on American exchanges using false numbers. And there's plenty of incentive to do so. So you see that happening all over China. And I looked at the fundamentals of a lot of companies and just kind of gnashed my teeth and thought, well, you know, these are terrible companies. Well, the fact is, what I've learned since then is you have to look at structural financing flows. And that's at least as important as the fundamentals of the company. So these companies are every bit as bad as I said they were, but their stocks just went up and up and up. So I was very wrong on that. As for
they can get more money, basically.
Sorry?
Because they can get more money from one source or another, not because their business is
well, it was basically that portfolio money was sloshing around the world looking for yield. And in the low rate environment of the post 2009 era, there was just a ton of money, you know, lapping on Chinese shores, and sort of moving into the stocks. So the stocks were going to go up no matter what was inside them. So that happened. But as for the whole country's system, I don't think I've ever said that the banks are going to collapse, because I don't think that.
No, I never heard you say that.
Yeah, and what I do think is that the Chinese leadership is sort of they're kind of like tigers in a cage, sort of walking, pacing back and forth, gnashing their teeth because they're caught between two problems. One or, you know, sort of Scylla and Charybdis sort of thing. So on one side, you have the mandate for growth, which is going to keep people happy. And growth in China has meant capital investment. And on the other side, you have the mandate to reduce the amount of renminbi that's pouring over the economy. Because if you go and liquidate everything, then you're going to drive down the exchange rate of the renminbi, and then everybody will be really unhappy. So they kind of can't pay for all the debt, but they can't not pay for the debt because then they can't grow the economy. So they just go back and forth between those two things. So what I think is that ultimately they're going to have to hose money on the economy, and that will drive the renminbi to sort of 10-to-1 to the dollar. And that will have very dire effects on Chinese investment, on its imports, on, you know, the cost of exports, which will, you know, depreciate. So it'll sort of push deflation into the world, on, you know, on all sorts of things.
So I earlier asked you, you know, was there something, you know, people like us or the West generally or the United States could have done differently in its dealings with China? How about the Communist Party themselves? I mean, the sort of, I don't know if you would describe it as a trap, but the situation they find themselves in now, it feels like there are fewer and fewer choices, as you've really just described. Could there have been something different done, you know, say 2012 when Xi Jinping came in, end of 2012, that would have... I think that people blame the current situation on Xi Jinping when really it's just in the structure of things. It was always going to happen. I think Xi Jinping is particularly ham-handed, perhaps, but it was always going to happen. You know, what the party should have done in 1989 is what no party ever does, which is give up power. And they didn't, and it had very, very dramatic consequences. So in order to retain power, they aggregated a whole lot of, or they arrogated a lot of power to the center. They changed the way the bureaucracies work. They pushed money out into the banks, and they made China a much less pleasant, but much more, ostensibly growing place. Right. There is one exception to that. My own home country of South Africa, the white nationalist government gave up power in the 1990s. So
yeah, but you know what, Jeremy, I've been alive longer than you have, and I remember how reluctant they were to do so.
Yes, they were very reluctant.
The big
they only really
were between the ANC and de Klerk.
They didn't have a lot of choice either. It's true. So you last went to China in 2019, and you say in the book that you might never visit again, hinting at the possibility of being trapped there, like the two Canadian Michaels. But they in fact were detained the year before you went back in 2018. Now, has your perception of the risk gone up since 2019, Or when you made that trip, was it with the awareness that it might be your last and you were just prepared to take a certain amount of risk to make it? Or how are you thinking about that question right now?
No, I had a ticket to go in February of 2020, I believe, right after we had an annual meeting for the company in the region, but the COVID doors closed, so I couldn't. And after that, now it's been a long time and the nature of China has changed. No, I won't go now. Is it because of politics? No, I don't think I'm important enough for the people in the Politburo to pay any attention to what I think about China. It's because of the very sort of backward draconian rules they have about detaining people who have passports to get out of the country should there be any legal action against them. And you don't know which legal actions there may be against you. So basically, any Chinese company can go to its local procuratorate and say, I don't like J Capital Research because they attacked my company, and bring a case. And then you won't know about it, but they won't let you out of the country. And it could be 5 years, 10 years.
Right. So, I mean, do you think because of the nature of J Capital, and maybe you can talk about a little bit, describe what it is exactly J Capital does, but is it part of the nature of your current work that makes you more aware or more reluctant to go back?
It is. I mean, I think that there's a range of risks. One risk is that my name is on the company that we still have in Beijing. I'm the legal representative, and you never know what kinds of problems the Chinese might find with that company for which they could detain you. There's the possibility. There's also the political stuff. I noticed that after I gave very boring, such boring testimony to a U.S. congressional committee that even I couldn't reread it. And yet the Chinese authorities paid a lot of attention. So the stuff that gets published online, I guess they have people who pay attention to. There's that. And then there's the nature of our work. So we are activist short investors, and we will do research pieces on companies that have problems and then publish those pieces. And a lot of the companies, based on basically my long experience in China, are Chinese companies that are listed overseas. So those companies naturally get very upset. So
Right.
they can find reason to bring lawsuits.
So you're making some enemies that one wouldn't want to have in China if you hope to leave.
Yeah, that's a much more succinct way of saying it. Yes.
And your book, after this book comes out, good luck.
But a lot of people write books. I don't think anybody's going to pay much attention to that.
Yeah, I mean, but, that is the odd thing about China, isn't it? That the uncertainty of these things and the randomness. I mean, I don't think the two Michaels thought that they were under any risk. It just happened that a certain chief financial officer happened to be arrested in Canada.
Yeah, good point. Good point. And that's the thing. I mean, even if the chance is only 5%, if it's 5 years of your life, you're not taking that 5% risk.
Yeah. The clock is ticking.
But what about you? I mean, you have a Chinese wife. Are you going back?
Not planning to anytime soon. But I don't know. It's part of the reason I'm curious, and I asking you about this is because I'm wondering about it too. I don't really have a need to go back. So it would be only because I want to go back. And, at the moment, tickets are still very expensive from the United States. So I'm not even really considering it.
FYI, round trip to Taiwan, just $1,000.
Right. So let's speak of Taiwan, because, when we were exchanging emails before this conversation, you mentioned that you had been in Taiwan and that it was, it reminded you that
fantastic.
You being in. There are going to be some people in Taiwan who's going to not like the fact that I say in the Chinese world, but, let's call it the China adjacent world for those who might take offense in Taiwan. What did you enjoy so much about Taiwan, and what is it that you think you're missing about?
Oh my God, everything. I mean, I've been to Taiwan before, but it was always on business. So I was rushing from hotel to taxi to train and not really noticing anything. Taiwan for me is the perfect blend because it's northern food and northern language, but southern climate for China and democracy. So, I'm not sure it's really fair to compare it to the mainland and say, well, this is what the mainland could have been if only we hadn't had the Communist Party, because the mainland's so much larger. Taiwan is the size of Maryland, so it's probably more governable. But there are all of these really interesting things that they do in policy. Like, for example, they're trying to encourage stores to issue fapiao, receipts. And so they have a lottery every month where they'll choose a receipt and they'll award somebody cash at random, $1,000 or $2,000 or something like that. And so it gives everybody incentive to keep their receipts and ask for receipts. So it's one of those things where Taiwan is focused on the carrot instead of the stick.
But that was something that the mainland used to do. I mean, they had remember that little scratch, you could scratch off the lottery number
right.
on the far, which I think they learned from Taiwan, but yeah.
Could be. I found that it's a panopticon there that they have. If you need to, if you lose something on the subway, you can ask a subway attendant, and they can find, with your subway ticket, they can find video of you going through each car and every platform. There are attendants in every office building who can track you on the sidewalk with their cameras. It's kind of unnerving, but also
reassuring. Someone has spent a lot of
time. I mean, this is something that it's something that I was blessedly free from living in China. But in the United States, as a female, you're always kind of looking over your shoulder and being aware of your surroundings. In Taiwan, nothing. In Taiwan, I came home one night on the subway at 1, 2 a.m. It didn't even occur to me to think of being attacked.
Right. Not at all. Yeah. So, are you doing business in Taiwan, or is this all pleasure?
No, actually, my daughter lives there, so I was visiting her.
Ah, okay. I see. That's wonderful. Let's change the subject a little bit and talk about Hello Kitty.
Okay.
So this is the book that, at least from its title, will not get you banned from going to China. Although if one would read it carefully, maybe it would. How different was it to write fiction compared to Wild Ride?
I would say not really very different. I mean, as you noted, it's the stories are really about they're really the sort of dystopian stories that you find all over China. I would say they're all sort of 70% truthful, and they're stories that you find all over China, and yet not what people expect. So it's kind of the sad, broken lives. I don't want to quite go that far, but the people who are stranded in yawning, empty apartment complexes, and people who have violence done to them that the police cover up or never do anything about. All of these kind of difficult stories that actually are going on all over China. It's not what people think should be happening in a country that's seen such growth.
Right. And the frustrations with the bureaucracy, the absurd contortions one has to go through to, invest in property, like get a divorce. And
Exactly.
it reminded me of quite a number of Chinese friends who haven't made enough money to pull themselves out of the kind of Sisyphean daily grind of getting the bills paid and making sure the family's happy, and not losing all their money on some bad investment in real estate or on the stock exchange.
Exactly. And this is the great lie of the real estate boom that, for a while, everybody you met in China, every taxi driver who picked you up at the airport had like $2 million worth of property, right? So you'd always think to yourself, well, why are you humping a cab like 90 hours a week and living with 10 other men in a dormitory when you could be selling these properties and moving to Australia and retiring? And yet they never did. And that just showed you how sort of what a fantasy world the property boom was.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, one last question, Anne. Can you, since your publisher, I think, is a relatively new publisher, perhaps you can talk a little bit about Bowie Jones and how you came to publish your two books with Bowie Jones?
He's a Vietnamese Australian, and he started his new imprint in Oxford, in the UK, and I think is a absolutely superb editor. He used to have a magazine called the Mekong Review, which you may know, which I wrote for a bit and became acquainted with him through that. And because
his full name is Min Bowie Jones, right?
Yes, exactly. And you know, I was familiar with him as really a great editor and a great person to work with, so wanted to do this with him.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Anne, it's been a real pleasure chatting to you. Thank you for joining ChinaFile Presents and
Okay, thank you.
the launch for the two books.
Thank you.